A millionaire old woman is saved by a poor boy during an incident. An unexpected encounter brings together two completely different lives. Hidden secrets from the mansion's past come to light and change everything. That boy would make it impossible to ignore the past and would change her destiny forever. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. The late afternoon sun tinged the sky of New York City with golden hues as Mrs. Eleanor left her mansion in the Upper East Side for the first time in months. At 78 years old, she carried the weight of a life full of accomplishments and regrets. Her hesitant steps echoed on the empty sidewalk, contrasting with the distant buzz of the metropolis. Eleanor adjusted the shawl over her shoulders, her gaze lost in memories of a past that insisted on haunting her. The tree-lined streets of the wealthy neighborhood seemed to observe her with curiosity, as if questioning the presence of that solitary figure in their domain. A few miles away in the neighborhood of Hopewell Gardens, young Peter, only 12 years old, ran through the narrow alleys with the agility of someone who knows every stone in the path. His brown eyes, lively and determined, hid the worries of a boy forced to grow up too fast. "Peter, don't forget your mother's medicine," shouted Mrs. Zoe from the window of her shack. The boy waved in response without slowing his pace. The weight of responsibility was his constant companion. At home, his mother, Mrs. Mary, fought against an illness that consumed her day by day, and his younger sister, Anna, only 7 years old, needed care beyond her years. That afternoon, Peter had a mission: to find some work, anything that could bring a little more money home. With his missing brother's work ID in his pocket, his only form of identification, he ventured beyond the borders of Hopewell Gardens. Fate, however, had different plans for Peter and Mrs. Eleanor that day. As she crossed Fifth Avenue, Eleanor felt a sudden dizziness. The world spun around her, and before she knew it, her legs weakened. She fell onto the asphalt, unable to get up. Time seemed to freeze. Cars passed by in slow motion. Horns sounded distant. Eleanor saw blurred faces of people who hesitated to help, perhaps fearing to get involved, or simply paralyzed by surprise. It was then that Peter appeared. The boy, who was passing by that exact spot at that moment, didn't hesitate. Ignoring the curious looks and voices warning him not to get involved, he ran towards the fallen lady. "Are you all right, Mom?" Peter asked, kneeling beside Eleanor. His eyes, full of genuine concern, met hers, frightened and confused. I can't get up," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling. With a strength that surprised even himself, Peter helped Eleanor to sit up. He looked around, seeking help, but people continued their routine as if the scene was invisible. "Don't worry, I'll call an ambulance," said Peter, already pulling out his old and cracked cell phone from his pocket. "No," Eleanor exclaimed, grabbing the boy's arm. "No need for an ambulance, I just need to get back home." Peter hesitated, torn between the desire to help and the fear of getting too involved. But something in Eleanor's look, a mixture of vulnerability and pride, made him decide. "All right," he agreed. "Where do you live?" "Nearby, on East 75th Street, Eleanor answered, trying to compose herself. Carefully and patiently, Peter helped Eleanor to stand up. She leaned on him, surprised by the strength of that skinny and fragile-looking boy. Together they began to walk slowly towards Eleanor's house. The journey, which Eleanor normally made in a few minutes, seemed to take an eternity. With each step, she felt the weight of years and the choices that had led her to this moment. Peter, in turn, fought against the urge to look back, to the world he had temporarily left behind to help a stranger. When they finally arrived at Eleanor's mansion, Peter couldn't hide his amazement. The imposing construction, with its wrought iron gates and well-tended gardens, seemed to have come from another world, a world very distant from the alleys of Hopewell Gardens. "Is this where you live?" he asked, unable to contain the surprise in his voice. Eleanor nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Yes, this is my home. A house too big for an old woman alone, don't you think?" Before Peter could respond, the gate opened and a middle-aged woman dressed in an impeccable uniform ran towards them. "Mrs. Eleanor, what happened?" the woman asked, distressed. "Nothing serious, Rose. This young man helped me. I had a small setback on the avenue," Eleanor replied, still leaning on Peter. Rose cast a suspicious look at the boy, but quickly turned her attention back to her employer. "Let's go inside. You need to rest." As Rose helped Eleanor to enter, Peter stood still, not knowing what to do. Part of him wanted to leave, to return to the reality he knew, but something kept him there as if an invisible thread tied him to that place. Eleanor turned to him one last time before entering. "What's your name, young man?" "Peter, ma'am." "Peter," she repeated as if savoring the name. "Thank you very much for your help. Please come back tomorrow. I'd like to thank you properly." Before Peter could protest, Eleanor and Rose disappeared into the house, leaving him alone in front of the gate that slowly closed. Peter stood there for a few moments, looking at the mansion, feeling as if he had just crossed a portal to another world, a world of possibilities and mysteries that he could barely imagine. With a head full of questions and a heart divided between curiosity and duty, Peter finally turned and began to walk back to Hopewell Gardens. The sun was already setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he walked, Peter couldn't help but think about the strange lady he had just met. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of sadness and secrecy that intrigued him, and that huge house so empty and silent. What else did it hide? Peter knew he should be looking for work, thinking about how to help his family, but the promise to return the next day echoed in his mind. Could this be the opportunity he was looking for? Or was he getting into something bigger than he could imagine? With these questions dancing in his head, Peter arrived home. His mother and sister were waiting for him, as always. He decided not to tell them about the encounter with Mrs. Eleanor, at least not yet. That would be his secret for now. That night, as the city fell asleep, two worlds that seemed so distant began to intertwine. In the mansion on the Upper East Side, Eleanor looked out the window thinking about the boy who had helped her. And in Hopewell Gardens, Peter dreamed of iron gates and mysterious gardens. Neither of them knew, but their lives had changed forever that afternoon. And this was just the beginning of a journey that would unearth long-hidden secrets, unite unlikely destinies, and prove that sometimes the most unexpected encounters are those that have the power to heal the deepest wounds. Morning arrived in New York City with a fine drizzle, typical of the city. In Hopewell Gardens, Peter woke up before the alarm, his hands sweaty with anxiety. The memory of meeting Mrs. Eleanor seemed like a distant dream, but the address scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper in his pocket confirmed the reality. "Mum, I need to leave early today," Peter said, as he helped Mrs. Mary sit at the table for breakfast. "Already, son? Did you find some work?" Mary's tired eyes lit up with a spark of hope. Peter hesitated. He didn't like hiding anything from his mother, but he feared creating expectations. "Maybe. I'm going to check out an opportunity." Anna, the younger sister, observed the scene with curiosity. "Can I come with you, Peter?" "Not today, little one," he replied, affectionately messing up his sister's hair. "But I promise to tell you everything later, okay?" With a quick kiss to his mother and a hug to Anna, Peter left, his heart racing with anticipation. At the mansion on the Upper East Side, Eleanor had also woken up early, something unusual in her routine of recent years. She moved around the house with renewed energy, surprising Rose, who found her in the kitchen. "Mrs. Eleanor, you shouldn't be up so early, especially after yesterday's scare," Rose exclaimed, concerned. Eleanor smiled, a gesture that Rose hadn't seen in a long time. "Nonsense, Rose, I'm fine. In fact, I'm expecting a visitor." Rose frowned. "A visitor? Don't tell me it's that boy from yesterday?" "Exactly," Eleanor replied, her tone leaving no room for arguments. "And I want you to treat him well when he arrives." Rose nodded reluctantly, but years of loyal service prevented her from questioning further. As she busied herself with the morning chores, she couldn't help but worry. It had been years since she had seen Eleanor so excited, and she feared that this sudden change could have unpredictable consequences. Peter arrived at the mansion shortly after 9, hesitating for a moment before ringing the doorbell. The sound echoed, imposing, making him question if he was really prepared for whatever was to come. It was Rose who answered, her critical gaze examining the boy from head to toe. "Mrs. Eleanor is waiting," she said dryly, leading him inside. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than Peter had imagined. Old paintings adorned the walls, and the marble floor reflected the light coming through the huge windows. Everything exuded an aura of grandeur and loneliness. Eleanor was waiting for them in the living room, seated in a red velvet armchair. Upon seeing Peter, her face lit up. "Ah, you came." It's good to see you, young man. Peter smiled shyly. Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. Are you feeling better? Much better, thanks to you, she replied, gesturing for him to sit down. Rose, please bring some snacks for our guest. Rose left, casting a last suspicious look at Peter before leaving the room. So, Peter, Eleanor began, leaning slightly forward, tell me about yourself. What does a young man like you do alone on that avenue yesterday? Peter hesitated, weighing his words. I was looking for work, Mrs. Eleanor. My family needs help, and I do what I can. Eleanor's eyes shone with a mixture of admiration and sadness. I see. And your parents? Do they know you're here? My father. Peter swallowed hard, the pain of absence still fresh. He's no longer with us. My mother is sick and I take care of her and my younger sister. Eleanor nodded, a shadow passing over her face. You carry a great weight for someone so young, Peter. At that moment, Rose returned with a tray of sandwiches and juice. Peter, realizing for the first time how hungry he was, thanked politely before starting to eat. Peter, Eleanor continued, her voice soft, I'd like to make you a proposal. I need help here at the mansion, someone to do small jobs, keep me company sometimes. It would be suitable work for a young man like you, and I would pay well. What do you think? Peter's eyes widened. It was more than he could have hoped for, but a voice in his head warned him to be cautious. I don't know, Mrs. Eleanor, it's very kind of you, but you barely know me, Eleanor completed, an understanding smile on her lips. And you're right to be cautious. How about we start slowly? Come a few hours a day, see if you adapt. If you don't like it, there's no commitment. Peter pondered for a moment. The opportunity seemed too good to be true, but something in Eleanor's look, a mixture of hope and loneliness, touched him deeply. All right, he finally agreed. I can try. Eleanor's face lit up. Excellent. Rose will show you the house and explain your tasks. As Rose, still reluctant, guided Peter through the mansion, Eleanor remained in the living room, lost in thought. For years, she had isolated herself from the world, carrying the weight of secrets and regrets. But something about that boy, in his courage and kindness, had lit a flame that she thought had been extinguished long ago. Peter, in turn, felt as if he had entered a completely new world. Each room in the mansion held stories, and he couldn't help but notice the empty spaces on the walls, where paintings seemed to have been removed, or the layer of dust on the piano in the corner of the music room. As they passed through a hallway, a locked door caught his attention. What's in there? He asked Rose. The housekeeper visibly tensed. That room has been closed for years. No one goes in there by Mrs. Eleanor's orders. Peter's curiosity was immediately piqued, but he knew it wasn't the time to ask more questions. At the end of the tour, Rose took him back to the room where Eleanor was waiting for them. So, what did you think of the house, Peter? The lady asked, a glimmer of expectation in her eyes. It's amazing, Mrs. Eleanor, Peter answered honestly. But it seems a bit sad too. Eleanor seemed surprised by the boy's perceptive observation. You're very observant, Peter. Perhaps you can bring some life back to this place. As he said goodbye, promising to return the next day to start work, Peter couldn't help but feel that he was getting involved in something bigger than he imagined. The mansion, with its silent corridors and locked doors, seemed to hold secrets that went far beyond his understanding. Back in Hopewell Gardens, Peter found his family anxious for news. With a mixture of excitement and caution, he told them about the job at the mansion, omitting the more intriguing details. Are you sure it's safe, son? Mrs. Mary asked, concern evident in her voice. I think so, Mum, Peter replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. And it could be the chance we've been waiting for. That night, lying in his bed, Peter couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with images of the mansion, Mrs. Eleanor's enigmatic look, the locked door in the hallway. He knew he was about to embark on a journey that would change his life, but he had no idea how deeply. In the mansion on the Upper East Side, Eleanor also remained awake, looking at an old photograph she kept hidden in her bedside table. It was the image of a smiling young man with the same eyes as hers. Maybe, she whispered to the photo, maybe there's still a chance to fix things. The night advanced, and with it, the secrets and promises that linked these two seemingly distant worlds began to intertwine. Fate had put Peter and Eleanor on a path of discovery and redemption, and the coming days would promise to reveal long-buried truths. The days that followed brought a new routine for Peter and Mrs. Eleanor. Every morning the boy arrived at the mansion, eager to discover what awaited him. Eleanor, in turn, seemed to rejuvenate with each visit, her posture more upright, her eyes brighter. On a particularly hot afternoon, Peter was cleaning the library shelves when a photo album slipped and fell to the floor, scattering some old images. Quickly he bent down to collect them, but one photo in particular caught his attention. It was an image of Eleanor, much younger, next to a middle-aged man and a young man who appeared to be about 20 years old. They were all smiling, looking happy and united. Peter couldn't help but notice the resemblance between the young man in the photo and Eleanor. This must be her son, Peter muttered to himself, remembering the vague mentions Eleanor had made about her family. "What do you have there, Peter?" Eleanor's voice startled him, making him almost drop the photo. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Eleanor," he stammered, extending the photograph. "It fell when I was cleaning and—" Eleanor took the photo, her fingers trembling slightly. Her gaze was lost in the image for a long moment, a mixture of emotions passing over her face. "Is that your son?" Peter asked softly, unable to contain his curiosity. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, this is Frank, my son. And this," she pointed to the older man, "was my husband, Anthony." "Was?" Peter noticed the use of the past tense. "He left us many years ago," Eleanor replied, her voice laden with an old sadness. Peter hesitated, but decided to risk one more question. "And your son? Where is he now?" Eleanor's face closed, a shadow passing over her eyes. "Frank, he's no longer here either. We made choices, both of us, that separated us." Before Peter could ask more, Rose appeared at the library door. "Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. Oliver has arrived for the visit." Eleanor seemed to instantly compose herself. "Ah, yes. Thank you, Rose. Peter, why don't you go help Rose in the kitchen while I attend to my guest?" Peter nodded, reluctant to leave the conversation halfway. As he followed Rose, he couldn't help but notice the change in Eleanor's behavior. Who was this Mr. Oliver? In the kitchen, Peter tried to extract information from Rose. "Who is Mr. Oliver? Does he come often?" Rose, always cautious, answered vaguely. "He's an old family friend. He started visiting Mrs. Eleanor more frequently in recent months." Peter was helping to organize the dishes when he heard voices coming from the hallway. Driven by curiosity, he quietly approached the kitchen door, trying to listen to the conversation. "We can't postpone it any longer, Eleanor," a man's deep voice was saying. "The documents need to be reviewed." "I know, Oliver," Eleanor's voice sounded tired. "But it's not that simple. There's a lot at stake. That's precisely why we need to act soon. Time is running out." Peter frowned, intrigued. What documents were these? And why did they seem so important? His thoughts were interrupted by Rose. "Peter, it's not polite to listen to other people's conversations." Embarrassed, the boy returned to his tasks, but his mind was buzzing with questions. Later, when Mr. Oliver had already left, Peter found Eleanor in the living room. She seemed thoughtful, almost worried. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Eleanor?" he asked, genuinely concerned. Eleanor smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "It is, Peter, just memories from the past that sometimes weigh more than they should." Encouraged by Eleanor's openness, Peter decided to share something from his own life. "You know, Mrs. Eleanor, I also have someone who's no longer here, my older brother, Luke." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Oh, Peter, I'm so sorry. What happened to him?" Peter swallowed hard, the pain of absence still fresh. "He disappeared 2 years ago. He went out to work one day and never came back. Nobody knows what happened." Eleanor got up from her armchair and, in a rare gesture of physical affection, hugged Peter. "Sometimes life separates us from the people we love in ways we don't understand," she said softly. At that moment, something changed between them. They were no longer just employer and employee, but two souls united by the pain of loss and the unknown. When Peter was about to leave, Eleanor called him again. "Peter, there's something I'd like you to do tomorrow." "Of course, Mrs. Eleanor. What is it?" She hesitated for a moment. "In the attic there are some old boxes. I'd like you to bring them down." "I think it's time to revisit some memories." Peter nodded, feeling that this task was more significant than it seemed. "I'll do that tomorrow morning." As he left the mansion, Peter couldn't help but feel that he was on the threshold of something important. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form in his mind. Eleanor's absent son, the mysterious Mr. Oliver, the important documents, and now the boxes in the attic. At home, Peter found his mother better than she had been in recent days. The money he was earning with Mrs. Eleanor had allowed them to buy the necessary medicines. "How was your day, son?" Mrs. Mary asked, noticing something different in Peter's look. "It was interesting, Mum," he replied, thoughtful. "I think Mrs. Eleanor is starting to trust me." Anna, who was playing on the small living room floor, looked at her brother with curiosity. "Are you going back there tomorrow, Peter?" "Yes, little one. And I think tomorrow might be a very special day." That night, both in the mansion on the Upper East Side and in the small apartment in Hopewell Gardens, Peter and Eleanor remained awake, their minds filled with questions and possibilities. Eleanor, sitting on her bed, looked at an old key she kept in her bedside table. It was the key to the locked room, the room that held so many memories and secrets. Tomorrow, she thought, might be the day to start opening some long-closed doors. Peter, in turn, dreamed awake about the attic boxes. What would they contain? What secrets from Mrs. Eleanor's past would be revealed? And how did all this connect to his own story, to his brother's disappearance? As the night progressed, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The next day promised to be the beginning of a journey of discoveries, a journey that would intertwine Peter and Eleanor's fates even more, revealing long-buried truths, and perhaps offering the chance of healing for old wounds. As sleep finally reached them, both felt, even if unconsciously, that they were on the verge of a great change. The past and present were about to collide, and the consequences of this collision would shape not only their lives, but those of everyone around them. The morning arrived with a thin fog covering New York City, as if the city itself was shrouded in mystery. Peter woke up before sunrise, his mind filled with expectations about what he might find in the attic of Mrs. Eleanor's mansion. Upon arriving at the house, he was greeted by Rose, who seemed more tense than usual. "Mrs. Eleanor asked you to go straight to the attic," she said, handing him an old key. "She'll join you soon." Peter climbed the stairs, his heart accelerating with each step. The attic was a spacious room, illuminated only by the light filtering through a small circular window. Piles of boxes and furniture covered by sheets created mysterious shadows. He began to examine the boxes, following Eleanor's instructions to separate those marked with the letter F. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the smell of mold and forgotten memories that permeated the air. "I see you've already started," Eleanor's voice surprised him. She was standing in the doorway, her gaze a mixture of anxiety and determination. "Yes, Mrs. Eleanor," Peter replied, pointing to the boxes he had separated. "Are these the ones?" Eleanor nodded, slowly approaching. "Yes, those are the ones. Let's take them to the office." Together, they carried the boxes downstairs. In the office, Eleanor hesitated before opening the first one. "Peter," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "what we're going to find here. These are parts of my life that have been hidden for a long time. Do you feel prepared for this?" Peter looked into Eleanor's eyes, seeing a vulnerability there that he had never noticed before. "I am, Mrs. Eleanor. You can trust me." With a deep sigh, Eleanor opened the first box. Inside, there was a mixture of photographs, letters, and small objects. She picked up a photo, showing it to Peter. It was the image of a young man, very similar to the one Peter had found in the library. "This is Frank, my son," Eleanor explained, her voice laden with emotion. "This photo was taken the day he graduated from engineering school." Peter observed the photo carefully. "He looks happy," he commented. "We were all happy back then," Eleanor replied, a sad smile on her lips. "Before everything changed." She continued to rummage through the box, pulling out letters and reading excerpts aloud. Peter listened attentively, trying to piece together the puzzle that was Mrs. Eleanor's life. "Frank was always idealistic," Eleanor explained. "He wanted to use his knowledge to help underprivileged communities, develop infrastructure projects in neglected areas." Peter felt a pang of recognition. "Like Hopewell Gardens." Eleanor looked at him, surprised. "Yes, exactly. In fact, Frank started a big project there a few years ago." Peter's heart raced. Could there be a connection between Eleanor's son and his own community? Perhaps even with his brother's disappearance? As they continued to explore the contents of the boxes, a knock on the door interrupted them. It was Rose, looking agitated. "Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. Oliver is here. He insists on speaking with you immediately." Eleanor frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Tell him I'm busy, Rose, to come back another day." But before Rose could leave, Oliver's deep voice sounded in the hallway. "Eleanor, it's urgent. We need to discuss the documents now." Eleanor exchanged a worried look with Peter. "Peter, dear, I need to attend to this. Why don't you continue organizing these things while I talk to Oliver?" Peter nodded, although his curiosity was piqued. Who was this Oliver, really? And what documents were so important? As soon as Eleanor left, Peter couldn't resist the temptation to approach the door, trying to hear the conversation. The voices came from the office next door. "We can no longer postpone it, Eleanor." Oliver's voice sounded urgent. "The deadlines are running out. If we don't act now, everything Frank fought for will be in vain." "You think I don't know that?" Eleanor's voice was laden with emotion. "But it's not that simple. There are complications." "What complications?" "Frank's project in Hopewell Gardens needs to be completed." "It's his legacy, Eleanor." Peter felt his heart leap. The project in Hopewell Gardens? What exactly was Frank doing in his community? He quickly returned to the boxes when he heard footsteps approaching. Eleanor entered the room, looking exhausted. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Eleanor?" Peter asked, trying to disguise that he had overheard the conversation. Eleanor smiled weakly. "Yes, Peter. Just complicated adult matters." She looked at the boxes, now partially organized. "Did you find anything interesting?" Peter hesitated for a moment, then decided to risk it. "Mrs. Eleanor, I heard you mention Hopewell Gardens. Your son, did he have a project there?" Eleanor's face transformed into a mixture of surprise and sadness. "Yes, Peter. Frank was developing a major infrastructure project in Hopewell Gardens. It was his dream, to improve people's lives there." "What happened?" Peter asked softly. Eleanor sat heavily in a nearby armchair. "The project faced obstacles. There were powerful people who didn't want to see changes in Hopewell Gardens, and then Frank disappeared." Peter felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "Disappeared, like my brother." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes widening with realization. "Your brother disappeared in Hopewell Gardens. When was this, Peter?" 2 years ago, Peter replied, his mind working furiously to connect the dots. "He was involved in some community project, but we never knew exactly what." Eleanor abruptly stood up, going to one of the boxes. She rummaged for a moment before pulling out a photograph. "Peter, look at this. Do you recognize anyone?" Peter took the photo, his heart almost stopping. There, next to Frank, was his brother Luke. They were on a construction site, smiling, clearly working together on something important. It's my brother," Peter stammered, hardly believing what he was seeing. "Was he working with your son?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "It seems so." "Oh, Peter, I think our stories are more intertwined than we imagined." At that moment, a knock on the door startled them. Rose entered, looking nervous. "Mrs. Eleanor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some men outside. They say they're from the City Hall and want to talk about the land in Hopewell Gardens." Eleanor visibly paled. "Tell them I'll be right out to meet them, Rose." When Rose left, Eleanor turned to Peter, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Peter, I think it's time we face some ghosts from the past. Are you with me?" Peter looked at the photo in his hands, at the smiling face of his brother next to Eleanor's son. He felt a wave of courage and purpose wash over him. "I am, Mrs. Eleanor. Let's uncover the truth together." As they prepared to face the unexpected visitors, Peter and Eleanor knew they were on the brink of revelations that could change everything. The mystery surrounding the disappearance of Frank and Luke, the project in Hopewell Gardens, and the secrets kept for so long were about to come to light. The attic, with its boxes full of memories, had been just the beginning. Now, they would have to dive into the past to understand the present, and perhaps shape the future not only of their families, but of an entire community. The tension in the living room of the mansion was palpable. Mrs. Eleanor, Peter, and Rose were seated across from 2 men in suits, who introduced themselves as representatives from the Department of Housing. The older of the two, a middle-aged man with shrewd eyes, was the first to speak. "Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, we're here to discuss the Hopewell Gardens revitalization project," he began, his voice formal and distant. "There are pending issues that need to be urgently resolved." Eleanor maintained her composure, though Peter could notice the slight tremor in her hands. "And what would those issues be, Mr. Miller?" "Albert Miller," the man replied. "The issues involved the property rights of the land where your son's project was being developed." Peter observed attentively, feeling that there was much more to this conversation than appeared on the surface. He noticed how the other man, younger and nervous, seemed uncomfortable, avoiding looking directly at Eleanor. "Frank's project had all the necessary authorizations," Eleanor responded firmly. "We have all the documentation that proves this." Miller smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, but complications have arisen. Apparently there are disputes over the ownership of the land. The city is considering revoking the authorizations." Peter couldn't contain his indignation. "But that's not fair. The project was helping so many people in Hopewell Gardens." Miller's eyes turned to Peter, a look of mild surprise on his face. "And who might you be, young man?" Before Peter could respond, Eleanor intervened. "This is Peter, my assistant. He knows the situation in Hopewell Gardens well." Miller seemed to consider this for a moment. "I see. Well, laws are complex, and sometimes what seems fair isn't always legally viable." It was at this moment that the younger man, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Mr. Miller, perhaps we should reconsider. The positive impact of the project is undeniable." Miller shot a sharp look at his colleague. "Johnson, we're not here to make moral judgments. We're here to resolve legal issues." Peter observed the dynamics between the two men, sensing that there was an untold story there. He decided to take a risk. "Mr. Johnson, are you familiar with the project?" Johnson seemed surprised by the direct question. Yes, I've studied the reports. It's an impressive project, actually." "And what happened to the people who were working on it?" Peter pressed, thinking of his brother. A heavy silence fell over the room. Miller seemed irritated by the direction of the conversation, while Johnson appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Eleanor, sensing the opportunity, decided to play her cards. "Gentlemen, I think we all know that there's more at stake here than just legal issues. The disappearance of my son, Frank, and others involved in the project cannot be ignored." Miller shifted uneasily in his chair. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your pain, but I don't see how this relates to the issues we came to discuss." It was then that Peter had an idea. He stood up abruptly. "Mrs. Eleanor, can I show them the photo we found?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Peter ran to the office and returned with the photograph they had discovered earlier. He placed it on the coffee table where everyone could see. "This is Frank," Peter said, pointing to Eleanor's son. "And this," his voice faltered a bit, "is my brother, Luke. They were working together on the project, and both disappeared." The effect was immediate. Johnson visibly paled, while Miller seemed to have been caught off guard. "Do you know what happened to them?" Peter asked directly, his eyes moving from Miller to Johnson. Johnson seemed on the verge of a breakdown. I don't..." Miller quickly intervened. "This is absurd. We came here to discuss legal issues, not to investigate disappearances." But Eleanor was not willing to back down. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Johnson, I think it's clear that there's much more going on here. I suggest we all be honest with each other." At that moment, the door to the living room opened and Oliver entered, looking agitated. "Eleanor, I'm sorry for the intrusion, but..." He stopped upon seeing the visitors. "What's going on here?" The tension in the room reached its peak. Miller stood up abruptly. "I think this meeting is over. We'll be back with a warrant if necessary." But before they could leave, Johnson exploded. "No, I can't be part of this anymore." He turned to Eleanor and Peter, tears in his eyes. "I know what happened to Frank and Luke. They discovered something big. Corruption, embezzlement involving powerful people in City Hall and businessmen." Miller looked furious. "Johnson, shut up immediately." But Johnson continued. "They were threatened. I helped them hide. They're alive, but they can't come back. Not while the people involved are still in power." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Peter felt his legs weaken, hope and fear mixing in his chest. His brother was alive. Eleanor stood up, her voice trembling but determined. "Mr. Johnson, we need to know everything. Where are they? How can we help them?" Miller, seeing that the situation was out of control, made a move towards the door, but Oliver blocked his exit. "I think you have a lot to explain, Mr. Miller," Oliver said, his voice cold. As chaos ensued in the room, with Miller shouting threats, Johnson collapsing in tears and confessions and Oliver calling the police, Peter and Eleanor looked at each other. They had unleashed something much bigger than they had imagined. "What do we do now?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor held his hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "Now, Peter, we fight. We fight to bring Frank and Luke back and to expose the truth no matter the cost." As police sirens began to sound in the distance, Peter knew that nothing would be the same again. The mystery surrounding his family and Eleanor's was just beginning to unravel, and the revelations to come promised to shake not only their lives, but the entire power structure of the city. The mansion, which for so long had been a refuge of secrets and sorrows, now became the epicenter of a battle for truth and justice. And at the center of this storm were Peter and Eleanor, united by a destiny that neither could have foreseen. The hours that followed the bombshell revelation from Johnson passed like a whirlwind. Mrs. Eleanor's mansion, once a sanctuary of silence and secrets, now buzzed with activity. Police officers came and went, lawyers made frantic calls, and journalists began to gather at the gates, sniffing out a big story. Peter observed everything with a mixture of fascination and fear. His world had turned upside down in a matter of hours. The news that his brother Luke was alive filled him with hope, but also with overwhelming anxiety. Where could he be? What were the conditions in which he lived? And more importantly, how to bring him back safely? Eleanor, in turn, oscillated between moments of fierce determination and periods of deep introspection. Seeing Frank's photo, knowing he was alive, had rekindled a flame she thought had been extinguished long ago. It was in the midst of this chaos that Oliver managed to get a moment alone with Eleanor and Peter in the library. "The situation is more complex than we imagined," Oliver began, his voice grave. "Johnson's accusations implicate very powerful figures in City Hall and the business world. We're dealing with a network of corruption that extends back years." "But what about Frank and Luke?" Peter asked anxiously. "How can we find them?" Oliver sighed heavily. "Johnson gave some clues about their whereabouts, but it's risky. They're hidden in a small town upstate, using false names. Approaching them could put them in danger." Eleanor, who had been silent until then, spoke with surprising determination. "It doesn't matter the risk. We need to bring them back and expose all this dirt." "It won't be easy, Eleanor," Oliver warned. "The people involved won't hesitate to use all possible means to stop us." It was at this moment that Rose hurriedly entered the library. "Mrs. Eleanor, there's a young woman outside insisting on speaking with Peter. She says it's urgent." Peter frowned, confused. "With me? Who is it?" "She said her name is Julia. She claims to be a journalist and to have important information about the case." The name made Peter jump. "Julia? My God, she was Luke's girlfriend!" Eleanor and Oliver exchanged worried looks. "Peter, are you sure we can trust her?" Eleanor asked. Peter hesitated for a moment, then nodded with conviction. "Yes, Julia has always been passionate about justice. If she says she has information, we should listen to her." Minutes later, Julia was led to the library. She was a young woman in her mid-20s, with keen eyes and a determined expression. Upon seeing Peter, her eyes filled with tears. "Peter," she said, her voice choked, I always knew there was more to the story of Luke's disappearance." After quick introductions and explanations, Julia revealed the reason for her visit. "I never stopped investigating Luke's disappearance. In recent months, I've managed to gather evidence that corroborates everything this Johnson revealed. I have documents, emails, even recordings that implicate powerful people in the corruption scheme in Hopewell Gardens." Julia's revelation injected new energy into the group. With her evidence, combined with Johnson's information, they had a real chance of exposing the entire scheme and, more importantly, of bringing Frank and Luke back safely. However, hope soon gave way to apprehension when Oliver's cell phone rang. His expression turned grim as he listened to the message. "That was my contact in the police," he said after hanging up. "Johnson was found unconscious in his cell. They're claiming attempted suicide, but we know it wasn't that," Eleanor completed, her voice cold with anger. Peter felt a chill run down his spine. The situation was escalating rapidly, and the forces against them seemed increasingly dangerous and relentless. It was at this moment of tension that a bold idea emerged in Peter's mind. What if we went to that small town upstate? If we could speak directly with Frank and Luke, we could bring them back and expose the whole truth at once. The suggestion was met with heavy silence. It was risky, potentially dangerous, but it could also be their best chance. Eleanor was the first to speak. "It's crazy," she said, then smiled, a glimmer of determination in her eyes. "But it might be our only option." Oliver seemed hesitant. "It's extremely dangerous. If we go, we need to be discreet and have a solid plan." Julia, who had been absorbing everything in silence, suddenly perked up. "I can help with that. I have contacts. I can arrange safe transportation, maybe even protection." As they discussed the details of the audacious plan, Peter couldn't help but feel a mixture of fear and excitement. They were about to embark on a journey that could change everything, not just for their families, but for the entire city. As night fell over New York, enveloping the mansion in shadows, the small group made final preparations for their clandestine mission. Peter looked out the window, at the city lights coming on, thinking of his brother and all the lives that had been affected by this web of corruption and lies. Eleanor approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready for this, Peter?" He turned to her, seeing in the lady's eyes the same mixture of fear and determination he felt. "I am, Mrs. Eleanor. Let's bring them back and do justice." As they prepared to leave, each carried their own fears and hopes. Eleanor, the chance to reconnect with her son and redeem the mistakes of the past. Peter, the possibility of reuniting his family and helping his community. Julia, the opportunity to expose the truth and reunite with her lost love. And Oliver, the challenge of navigating the turbulent waters of politics and justice. What awaited them in this small upstate town was a mystery. But one thing was certain. Nothing would be the same when they returned. The truth, long buried, was about to come to light, and with it the promise of change and redemption. As they left the mansion under the cover of night, each felt the weight of responsibility and the thrill of expectation. The journey that was beginning promised to be dangerous, exciting, and above all, transformative. The night was a dark blanket over the road that snaked out of New York City. Inside a discreet van, Peter, Mrs. Eleanor, Julia, and Oliver traveled in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts and apprehensions. Peter looked out the window, watching the city lights give way to the darkness of the countryside. His heart beat fast with the expectation of seeing Luke again after so long. Beside him, Mrs. Eleanor firmly held an old photograph of Frank, as if it were a talisman that would guide them to her son. Julia, seated in the front next to the driver, a taciturn man she assured was trustworthy, typed frantically on her laptop, cross-referencing information and plotting alternative routes in case they needed to shake off potential pursuers. It was Oliver who finally broke the tense silence. "We're approaching Riverdale," he announced, consulting a map on his cell phone. "It's the town where Johnson said Frank and Luke would be hiding." The mention of the town's name seemed to awaken something in Mrs. Eleanor. "Riverdale," she murmured, her eyes distant. "I met Anthony there so many years ago." Peter looked at her, curious. "Anthony? Frank's father?" Eleanor nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Yes, we were young, full of dreams. Anthony was starting his political career, and I was just a small-town girl with big ambitions." "What happened?" Peter asked softly, feeling that he was about to unravel another layer of the mystery surrounding Mrs. Eleanor's life. The lady sighed deeply before continuing. "We fell in love, got married, moved to New York. Anthony rose quickly in politics, and I became a successful businesswoman. We had everything, or at least that's what we thought." Her voice faltered a bit as she continued. "But power comes at a price, Peter. Gradually, Anthony began to get involved with the wrong people, making deals that went against everything we believed in. When Frank was born, I promised myself that I would protect him from that world, that he would be different." Peter could feel the weight of guilt in Eleanor's words. "Is that why Frank decided to work in Hopewell Gardens? To make a difference?" Eleanor nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "He wanted to fix his father's mistakes, to do something truly good. I supported him, of course, but I also feared for him. I knew he was messing with powerful forces." Julia, who had been listening attentively, turned back. "And that's where Luke got involved, right? Working on Frank's project?" "Yes," Peter replied, the pieces fitting together in his mind. "Luke always talked about a big project that would change everything, but he never went into details. Now I understand why." Oliver, who had been silent, finally spoke. Frank's project was revolutionary. It wasn't just about infrastructure, but about community empowerment, education, health. If it had been successful, it could have become a model for the entire country. And that's why they wanted to stop it, Julia concluded, her voice laden with indignation. Because it threatened an entire corrupt system. The group fell silent again, each processing the revelations and their implications. The van continued its journey through the night, bringing them ever closer to their destination and, they hoped, to the answers they sought. When they finally reached the outskirts of Riverdale, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first rays of dawn. The small town, nestled among verdant hills, seemed to have come out of a bucolic painting. "What now?" Peter asked, feeling a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Oliver consulted some notes. Johnson mentioned an old mansion on the outskirts of town. He said Frank and Luke would be working there disguised as restorers. Julia was already typing furiously on her laptop. "Found it! There's a historic mansion being restored about 3 miles from here. It must be there." As they approached the indicated location, the tension in the group was palpable. Peter felt his heart pounding in his chest. After 2 years, was he about to see his brother again? The mansion came into view, an imposing 19th century construction that had seen better days. Scaffolding and protective tarps covered part of the facade, indicating that restoration work was in progress. Cautiously, the group approached. Oliver was the first to get out of the van, followed closely by Peter and Eleanor. Julia stayed behind, standing guard and ready to alert them if she noticed anything suspicious. As they approached the entrance, they heard the sound of hammers and voices coming from inside. Peter felt his legs weaken. One of the voices, could it be? It was then that a figure emerged from behind some scaffolding, tall, with stubble and safety goggles on his head, but unmistakable. "Luke!" Peter called, his voice trembling. The man froze, his eyes widening in shock and recognition. "Peter! My God, Peter!" The two brothers ran to each other, merging into an emotional embrace. Tears flowed freely down both their faces, years of longing and worry dissolving in that moment. Attracted by the noise, another man came out of the mansion, older, with grey hair at the temples, but with the same penetrating eyes as Eleanor. "Frank," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely above a sigh. Mother and son stared at each other for a long moment, a myriad of emotions passing between them. Then, as if a dam had broken, they ran to each other, years of separation and misunderstandings dissolving in tears and embraces. Oliver watched the scene with a mixture of relief and concern. They had found Frank and Luke, yes, but this was just the beginning. There was still a long battle ahead. As the emotional reunions continued, Julia approached the group, her eyes fixed on Luke. When their gazes met, time seemed to stop. Amidst all the chaos and danger, a long-lost love was finding its way back. There, on the outskirts of a small upstate town, under the light of the rising sun, a new chapter was about to begin. Secrets would be revealed, truths faced, and battles fought. But at that moment, all that mattered was that long-separated families were finally reunited. The mansion, a silent witness to this reunion, seemed to come to new life, as if the old walls themselves understood that, just as they were being restored, so too were the lives of these people finding a chance for reconstruction and redemption. The sun was already high in the sky when the group finally gathered inside the old mansion. The smell of fresh paint and old wood filled the air, mixing with the palpable tension emanating from all present. Peter, Luke, Mrs. Eleanor, Frank, Julia, and Oliver formed an irregular circle in the main room, each struggling to process the events of the last few hours. Frank was the first to break the silence. "Mum, how did you find us?" His voice betrayed a mixture of relief and concern. Eleanor, still holding her son's hand as if fearing he might disappear again, replied, "It was a long journey, my son, but the important thing is that we're here now." Oliver stepped forward, his expression serious. "Frank, Luke, the situation in New York has become complicated. Johnson, a City Hall employee, revealed part of the corruption scheme. He mentioned your whereabouts, but soon after was silenced." Luke visibly paled. "My God, so they know? Are we in danger?" Julia, who until then had been observing Luke with a mixture of love and hurt, intervened. "For now, we believe we're safe. We took precautions not to be followed, But we can't stay here for long. Peter, still trying to absorb the reality of having his brother back, asked, "Luke, Frank, what exactly did you discover? Why did you have to hide?" Frank and Luke exchanged significant looks before Frank began to explain. The project in Hopewell Gardens was bigger than anyone imagined. It wasn't just about infrastructure improvements, but about exposing decades of corruption and neglect. Luke continued, "We found documents, Peter, evidence of embezzlement, illegal deals, even involvement with criminal organizations, all to keep Hopewell Gardens and other underprivileged communities under control, preventing their real development." Eleanor let out a trembling sigh. "Anthony, your father was involved in this, wasn't he?" Frank nodded sadly. "Yes, Mum, Dad was a key player in the scheme. When I confronted him, well, that's when I realized we needed to disappear." The weight of this revelation fell on the group like an avalanche. Eleanor seemed to have aged years in seconds, the weight of her husband's betrayal clearly visible on her shoulders. Oliver, always pragmatic, brought the discussion back to the present. "What did you do with the evidence you collected?" "It's safe," Luke replied, "hidden in various places, some physical, others digital. We didn't want to risk losing everything if we were discovered." Julia, her eyes shining with the prospect of a big story, asked, "And now, what's the plan?" It was at this moment that Peter, the youngest in the group, surprised everyone with his clarity of thought. "We need to go back to New York," he declared. "We can't hide anymore. It's time to face this head-on, expose the truth, and fight for Hopewell Gardens and all the other affected communities." The silence that followed was laden with tension and contemplation. Everyone in the room knew that Peter's decision, though courageous, also meant facing unimaginable dangers. Frank was the first to agree. "Peter is right. We spent 2 years hiding, trying to find more evidence, but the truth is, we already have enough. It's time to act." Eleanor, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and fear, nodded. "It won't be easy. We'll be facing powerful people, willing to do anything to keep their secrets. But we're not alone," Julia added, her tone determined. "I have contacts in the press. I can ensure that the story is widely publicized, making it harder for them to silence us." Oliver, who had been thoughtful, finally spoke. "I have some trustworthy allies in the district attorney's office. If we can present the evidence properly, we can initiate an official investigation." As they discussed the details of their audacious plan, a renewed energy seemed to fill the old mansion. Fear was still present, of course, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose and hope. Luke, who had been quiet for some time, suddenly turned to Peter, his eyes full of emotion. "Brother, I'm so sorry for disappearing like that. You, Mom, Anna, you must have suffered so much." Peter hugged his older brother, silent tears running down his face. "The important thing is that you're back, and now we'll fight together." As the group finalized preparations for their return to New York, each carried their own fears and hopes. Eleanor, determined to fix the mistakes of the past and protect her son. Frank, ready to complete the mission he had begun years ago. Luke and Julia, rediscovering their love amidst the chaos. Oliver, navigating the legal and political complexities that awaited them. And Peter, the young man whose courage and compassion had been the catalyst for this entire journey. As they left the mansion, the afternoon sun cast long shadows on the ground. It was as if time itself was marking the end of an era of secrets and the beginning of a new journey in search of truth and justice. The road back to New York would be dangerous, fraught with obstacles and threats. But for this unlikely group of heroes, it was the only possible path. Together they carried not only the hopes of their own families, but those of an entire community, eager for change and redemption. As the van pulled away from Riverdale, taking them back to the epicenter of the storm that was about to unleash, each of them knew that regardless of the outcome, their lives would never be the same again. The truth, long suppressed, was about to come to light, and with it, the promise of a new dawn for Hopewell Gardens, and for all of them. The arrival in New York was like diving into a hornet's nest. As soon as they crossed the city limits, the group felt the weight of the mission they had ahead. The grey sky and heavy air seemed to reflect the tension that hung over them. Oliver, always cautious, had arranged a safe place for them to meet. An old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. It was there that the group began to outline their strategy. "We need to act fast," Frank said, spreading documents over an improvised table. Every minute that passes is a chance for them to prepare or destroy evidence. Julia, who hadn't left her laptop, added, "I have reliable sources in 3 major newspapers. They're ready to publish as soon as we give the signal." Luke, still adjusting to the idea of being back, asked, "What about security? We can't underestimate what these people are capable of." Oliver nodded gravely. "I've already taken care of that. I have contacts in the federal police who are on standby. As soon as we start releasing the information, they'll initiate search and seizure operations." While the adults discussed the details of the plan, Peter observed everything with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. His gaze met Mrs. Eleanor's, who seemed equally impressed and concerned. "Peter," she called softly, pulling him aside, "you understand the danger we're getting into, don't you?" The young man nodded, his expression serious beyond his years. "I understand, Mrs. Eleanor, but I also know it's the right thing to do. For Hopewell Gardens, for all the communities that suffer from this corruption." Eleanor smiled, a mix of pride and sadness in her eyes. "You remind me of Frank when he was younger, so full of ideals, of courage." She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "Peter, promise me something. If things get too dangerous, you'll step away, you'll protect yourself." Peter hesitated, but before he could respond, they were interrupted by an exclamation from Julia. "Guys, you need to see this," she called, turning her laptop so everyone could see. On the screen, a striking headline announced, "Corruption Scandal Rocks New York City Hall, High-Ranking Officials Implicated." The group gathered around the computer, reading avidly. Apparently, some of the information they had collected had already leaked, causing a stir in the media and political circles. "This changes everything," Oliver murmured, his mind already calculating the implications. "We need to act now, before they have a chance to control the narrative." Frank agreed. "It's our chance to present all the evidence at once. Julia, can you ensure that your press contacts are ready?" The journalist was already typing furiously. "I'm in contact with them right now. We can go live on all major networks in 2 hours." Luke, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke. "And Hopewell Gardens? How can we ensure that the community is protected when all this blows up?" It was Peter who answered, surprising everyone with his assertiveness. "I can take care of that. I know people there, community leaders. I can alert them, make sure they're prepared." Eleanor seemed to want to protest, but Frank gently interrupted her. "Mum, Peter is no longer a child. He's a fundamental part of all this." With an action plan defined, the group split up for their respective tasks. Julia and Oliver went to coordinate the release of information and the start of official investigations. Frank and Luke prepared to give detailed statements to the authorities, and Peter, accompanied by Eleanor, set off for Hopewell Gardens. The trip to the community was tense. The streets seemed more agitated than usual, as if the entire city could feel the storm that was about to break. Upon arriving at Hopewell Gardens, Peter and Eleanor were greeted by Mrs. Zoe, the neighbor who had always looked after Peter's family. "My goodness, boy, where have you been?" she exclaimed, hugging Peter tightly. Then, noticing Eleanor, her eyes widened in recognition. "And you're the owner of that project, aren't you?" Eleanor nodded, a little uncomfortable. "Yes, I am. Mrs. Zoe, we need your help. Important things are about to happen, and the community needs to be prepared." As they explained the situation to Mrs. Zoe and other community leaders who started arriving, Peter couldn't help but notice how people looked at Eleanor, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and a hint of distrust. "Are you sure about this?" asked Mr. John, one of the oldest residents. "We've seen many promises of change that came to nothing." It was at this moment that Peter stepped forward, his voice firm and passionate. "I understand your distrust. We live with it every day, but this time it's different. We have evidence. We have powerful allies. This is our chance to really change things, not just for Hopewell Gardens, but for all communities that suffer from neglect and corruption." His impromptu speech seemed to touch those present. One by one, the community leaders began to nod, willing to trust and act. As they organized teams to inform and protect residents, Eleanor watched Peter with a new look. The boy she had met a few months ago had transformed into a young leader, courageous and compassionate. Suddenly, Eleanor's cell phone rang. It was Frank. "Mom, it's starting. The first reports are already on the air. The federal police are moving." Eleanor and Peter looked at each other, a mixture of fear and determination on their faces. The battle they had planned for so long was finally beginning, As the sun set over New York, casting long shadows over Hopewell Gardens, a feeling of anticipation hung in the air. In the coming hours, the fate of many would be decided. Long-held secrets would come to light, the powerful would fall, and the hope for a better future would begin to bloom. Peter, standing next to Eleanor, looked at the community that had always been his home. "We're doing the right thing, aren't we?" he asked, a touch of uncertainty in his voice. Eleanor held his hand, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "Yes, Peter. It won't be easy, but it's the right path. Together we'll face whatever comes." And so, as night fell over the city, the unlikely group of heroes prepared for the battle of their lives. A battle not just for justice, but for the future of an entire community and for the redemption of their own pasts. The following morning dawned with New York in an uproar. Headlines screamed about the corruption scandal, while images of politicians and businessmen being led away by federal police dominated the news. The city, normally an anthill of activity, seemed to have entered a state of collective shock. At the center of this whirlwind, the group led by Frank and Eleanor watched the events unfold from their improvised hideout. Julia barely took her eyes off her laptop, coordinating with journalists and checking online repercussions. Oliver was in constant communication with his contacts in the district attorney's office, ensuring that each piece of evidence was properly recorded and investigated. Luke and Peter, in turn, maintained direct contact with community leaders in Hopewell Gardens, guiding them on how to deal with the wave of reporters and curious onlookers who were beginning to invade the community. "It's incredible," Frank murmured, watching a live broadcast of protesters gathering in front of City Hall. "After so long, it's finally happening." Eleanor placed a comforting hand on her son's shoulder. "You made this happen, Frank, you and Luke. I'm so proud of you both." The moment of contemplation was interrupted by a shout from Julia. "Guys, you need to see this!" Everyone crowded around her computer. On the screen, an impromptu press conference showed the mayor visibly shaken, surrounded by nervous advisors. "In light of the serious accusations, I am temporarily stepping down from office to fully cooperate with the investigations," the mayor declared, his voice trembling. A buzz of excitement ran through the group. It was more than they could have hoped for so quickly. But the euphoria was short-lived. Oliver's phone rang, his expression turning grim as he listened. "We have a problem," he announced after hanging up. "I just received information that some of those involved are trying to flee the country, and there are rumors that documents are being destroyed en masse." "We need to act," Frank declared, his voice laden with urgency. "We can't let them escape or destroy the evidence." It was at this moment that Peter stepped forward, his expression determined. "I have an idea. In Hopewell Gardens, there's a group of young hackers I know. They can help track suspicious movements, maybe even recover digital documents before they're erased." Julia looked at the young man with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "That's brilliant, Peter. With their help, we can create a digital surveillance network." Eleanor seemed hesitant. "It's dangerous to involve more people, especially young ones." But Luke supported his brother's idea. "Mom, Peter is right. We need all the allies we can get now. And who better to fight for Hopewell Gardens' future than its own young people?" With the plan in action, the group split up again. Peter and Luke set off for Hopewell Gardens to coordinate with the young hackers, while Julia and Frank prepared for a series of exclusive interviews, revealing details of the corruption scheme they had uncovered. Eleanor and Oliver, in turn, headed to a secret meeting with members of the Federal Police Task Force, bringing with them the physical evidence that had been carefully preserved. The city seemed to be on the brink of a breaking point. In the streets, peaceful demonstrations mixed with moments of tension. The police were on high alert, fearing possible retaliation from the powerful who were being exposed. In Hopewell Gardens, Peter and Luke found the community in a state of agitation never seen before. Young people gathered around improvised computers, their technological skills now in service of a greater cause. "It's amazing to see this," Luke commented, observing the fervor and dedication of the young hackers. "They're rewriting the community's future with their own hands." Peter smiled, a mixture of pride and hope in his eyes. This is how it always should have been. Hopewell Gardens taking the reins of its own destiny. Meanwhile, in the city center, Julia and Frank faced a battery of interviews. Cameras, flashes, and microphones surrounded them as they revealed, piece by piece, the intricate puzzle of corruption they had unraveled. What we're seeing today, Frank declared on national television, is the result of years of struggle. It's not just about exposing criminals, but about giving voice and power to communities that have been silenced for so long. As the day progressed, revelations continued to arrive. Thanks to the tireless work of the young hackers from Hopewell Gardens, compromising emails and suspicious financial transactions came to light every hour. The network of corruption, which seemed so impenetrable just a few days ago, was now rapidly unraveling. But with each victory, the sense of danger also grew. Eleanor, reunited with Oliver after the meeting with the authorities, couldn't shake off a feeling of apprehension. "They won't give up easily," she murmured, looking out the car window that was taking them back to the hideout. "The more we corner them, the more dangerous they become." Oliver nodded gravely. "You're right. We need to be prepared for anything." When night fell over New York, the group gathered again, exhausted but determined. News continued to arrive. More arrests, more revelations, the promise of a complete and impartial investigation. "We made history today," Julia declared, a tired smile on her face. "But this is just the beginning," Frank agreed. "The real work starts now, rebuilding, reforming, ensuring this never happens again." As they discussed the next steps, Peter noticed something strange through the window. A dark car parked across the street, its occupants observing the building with suspicious interest. "Guys," he called, his voice tense. "I think we have company." The group quickly gathered around the window, the reality of their situation hitting them with full force. They had messed with powerful forces, and now those forces were ready to strike back. Eleanor looked at each of them, her expression a mixture of determination and maternal concern. "Remember, no matter what happens, we're in this together. Everything we've done for truth and justice." As they prepared to face whatever came next, one thing was clear. The battle they had initiated was far from over. The night would be long and the dawn uncertain, but united, they would face whatever came for the redemption of their pasts and for the future of Hopewell Gardens. The tension in the air was palpable as the group observed the suspicious car across the street. It was Oliver who broke the silence, his voice low and urgent. "We have to get out of here, now." There was no discussion. In minutes, everyone was on the move, grabbing only the essentials. Peter felt the weight of responsibility as he sent a quick message to the community leaders in Hopewell Gardens, alerting them to stay vigilant. They left through the back of the building, splitting into two groups: Eleanor, Frank, and Oliver in one car, Peter, Luke, and Julia in another. The nighttime city seemed like a labyrinth of shadows and lights, each corner potentially hiding a danger. In Peter's car, the silence was broken only by the sound of the radio, where news continued to detail the day's revelations. "Where are we going?" Luke asked, his eyes constantly checking the rear-view mirror. Julia, who was at the wheel, responded with determination. "I have a contact, a safe house on the outskirts of the city. We can regroup there and plan our next move." Meanwhile, in the other car, Eleanor couldn't contain her concern. "Frank, are you sure we did the right thing? Look at the danger we've put everyone in, especially Peter and the young people of Hopewell Gardens." Frank held his mother's hand, his gaze firm. "Mum, sometimes the price of truth is high, but the cost of remaining silent would be even greater." Oliver, who was in constant contact with his allies, suddenly straightened up. "We have a problem. I just received information that there was a suspicious fire in one of the warehouses where we kept documents." The news fell like a bomb. Part of the evidence so carefully collected over the years could be lost. When they finally arrived at the safe house, a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of New York, the group was exhausted, but far from defeated. Gathered in the simple living room, they began to assess their situation. Julia, always connected, brought the latest updates. Social media is boiling. There are protests being organized across the country. People are demanding justice. Peter, who had been in constant contact with his friends in Hopewell Gardens, added, "The community is united like never before. They're protecting each other, sharing information. It's amazing to see." Eleanor observed the young man with a mixture of pride and concern. In such a short time, he had transformed from a frightened boy into a courageous leader. Oliver, always pragmatic, brought the group back to reality. "We still have a long way to go." The fire in the warehouse was a hard blow, but not fatal. We need to ensure that the remaining evidence reaches the right authorities. It was at this moment that Frank had a bold idea. What if, instead of hiding, we went public? Tell our story, all of it, leaving nothing out. The suggestion was met with stunned silence. It was risky, potentially dangerous, but it could also be their best defense. Luke was the first to support it. Frank is right. The more exposed we are, the harder it will be for them to silence us. Julia, with her journalistic instincts sharpened, was already planning. I can organize a live broadcast on several platforms simultaneously. It would be impossible to censor. As they discussed the details, Peter stepped away a bit, looking out the window at the starry night. He thought about his family, about Hopewell Gardens, about all the lives that would be affected by their actions. Eleanor approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right, Peter?" The young man turned, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "Mrs. Eleanor, when all this is over, what happens next? For Hopewell Gardens, for all of us?" Eleanor smiled, a smile full of hope and affection. "Afterwards, my dear, we start rebuilding. It won't be easy, but we'll do it together. Your community, my family. I think we're all part of something bigger now." The conversation was interrupted by an alert on Julia's phone. She visibly paled as she read the message. "What is it?" Frank asked, noticing her expression. Julia looked at the group, her voice trembling. "I just received information. Someone leaked our location. They're coming." Panic threatened to take over, but it was Peter who surprisingly kept his calm. "Then it's now. We have no choice but to go ahead with Frank's plan. Let's go public right now." With a speed born of urgency, the group mobilized. Julia began preparing the live broadcast, while the others organized the evidence and prepared their statements. Eleanor looked at Frank, then at Peter, Luke, and the others. At that moment, she saw not just her family, but a group of unlikely heroes united by a purpose greater than themselves. "Is everyone ready?" Julia asked, her finger hovering over the button that would start the broadcast. Frank stepped forward, his posture erect, his voice firm. "We are. It's time to tell our story to the world." As Julia counted down to the start of the broadcast, each member of the group felt the weight of the moment. They were about to change the course of history, not just for New York or Hopewell Gardens, but potentially for the entire country. Peter closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about his journey since that first encounter with Mrs. Eleanor. When he opened them again, they were full of determination. The red light on the camera turned on, indicating they were live. Frank began to speak. "Good evening, America. My name is Frank Thompson, and I have a story to tell. A story of corruption, of courage, and of hope." As the words flowed, revealing long-hidden truths, the group knew there was no turning back. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and dangers. But at that moment, united by truth and the pursuit of justice, they were making history. And out there on the streets of New York, in Hopewell Gardens, and in communities across America, people gathered around screens, listening intently. The seed of change had been planted, and it was about to bloom. The weeks that followed the live broadcast were a whirlwind of events. The story told by Frank, Eleanor, Peter, and the others spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of the entire country. Social media exploded with supportive hashtags, while the streets filled with protesters demanding justice and change. Mrs. Eleanor's mansion, once a symbol of isolation and secrets, had now become an improvised headquarters for the reform movement sweeping through New York. It was there that the group met daily, coordinating actions, giving interviews, and planning next steps. Peter, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watched the sun rise over the city. It seemed like years had passed since that first encounter with Mrs. Eleanor on the busy avenue. Thinking about how much things have changed, Luke's voice pulled him from his reverie. His brother joined him, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. Peter nodded. "It's hard to believe we did it, isn't it? That we really made a difference." Inside the house, activity was already starting early. Julia, who had barely slept in the past few weeks, was coordinating a team of investigative journalists who continued to unearth new details of the corruption scheme. Frank and Oliver spent hours in meetings with prosecutors and investigators, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly documented and processed. The legal battle was far from over, but they were gaining ground every day. Eleanor, in turn, had become a central figure in the urban reform movement. Her business experience, combined with her newly discovered passion for social justice, made her a powerful spokesperson for underprivileged communities. It was in the midst of this bustle that Peter received news that would change everything again. Mrs. Mary, his mother, called with a voice choked with emotion. "Peter, my son, you won't believe it. The hospital, they said they found a new treatment. There's a real chance of a cure." Tears flowed freely down Peter's face as he shared the news with the others. It was as if the universe was finally repaying all the good they had done. That afternoon, a special meeting was called at the mansion. Representatives from Hopewell Gardens, community leaders from other low-income neighborhoods, reform-minded politicians and activists joined the original group. Frank took the floor, his voice laden with emotion and determination. "What we've achieved in the past few weeks is just the beginning. We've exposed corruption, yes, but now we have the responsibility to rebuild, to create a system that truly serves all citizens, especially those who have been neglected for so long." Eleanor stood up beside her son. "That's why we're here today, to announce the creation of the New Horizons Foundation, an organization dedicated to implementing sustainable development projects in underprivileged communities, starting with Hopewell Gardens." The news was met with enthusiastic applause. Peter, seated between Luke and Julia, felt a wave of pride and hope. This was the legacy they were building. Months passed and changes began to become visible. In Hopewell Gardens, the once neglected streets now saw infrastructure works. Schools were renovated, professional training programs were implemented, and a feeling of hope permeated the community. Peter, now a respected young leader, walked the streets of his community with a new purpose. Children greeted him with smiles, the elderly with nods of recognition. He was a living symbol that change was possible. On a sunny afternoon, Peter took Mrs. Eleanor for a walk through Hopewell Gardens. The lady, who had once lived isolated in her mansion, was now a familiar and beloved presence in the community. "You know, Peter," she said, watching a group of children playing in a new playground, "when I think about how it all started, that day on the avenue, it almost seems like a miracle." Peter smiled, remembering that fateful moment. "It wasn't a miracle, Mrs. Eleanor. It was courage. Yours, mine, all of ours." They stopped in front of a newly painted mural. It depicted the faces of Frank, Luke, Julia, Oliver, Eleanor, and Peter, along with scenes of the community in transformation. In the center, in bright letters, it read, "The future belongs to those who have the courage to dream it." That night, a big celebration was held in the central square of Hopewell Gardens. Music, dance, and laughter filled the air. Frank and Luke chatted animatedly with young local entrepreneurs, discussing new projects and ideas. Julia, now an award-winning journalist, documented everything, determined to show the world the power of social transformation. Oliver, who had decided to leave corporate law to dedicate himself to social causes, was surrounded by a group of law students, inspiring a new generation of justice advocates. At the center of it all, Peter danced with his mother, Mrs. Mary, her health restored, her eyes shining with happiness and pride. Anna, his younger sister, ran among the guests, her contagious laughter symbolizing the joy of a new era. Eleanor watched it all with tears in her eyes. She thought of Anthony, of all the choices that had led them to this moment. There was regret, yes, but also a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. As the party continued into the night, Peter stepped away for a moment, climbing to a high point in the community. From there, he could see all of Hopewell Gardens, the lights of the celebration mixing with those of the city beyond. Luke joined him, putting an arm around his younger brother's shoulders. "What are you thinking about, little bro?" Peter smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm thinking about the future, about everything we still have to do." Luke nodded, understanding. "There's still a lot of work ahead." "Yes," Peter agreed, "but for the first time, I feel like we can really make a difference, that the future is in our hands." The two brothers stood there contemplating the city they had helped transform. Below them, the party continued, a celebration not just of what they had achieved, but of what was yet to come. In Mrs. Eleanor's mansion, now transformed into a community center, the old piano played once again. The music, once silenced by pain and secrets, now echoed as a hymn of hope and renewal. And so, as a new era dawned for Hopewell Gardens and for New York, the legacy of courage, compassion, and change initiated by an unlikely encounter between a lonely lady and a brave young man, continued to flourish, promising a brighter future for all.